假如今年的大选是哈里斯当选，而不是特朗普当选的话，那两人有哪些政策跟做法其实是不会改变的呢？我在美国当记者将近18年之后，最想找到的答案不是美国的分歧和差异，而是美国的不变。因为只有不变才能够找出规律，并且看懂美国。这次在大选前，我独家专访了美国国际政治学大师米尔斯海默，目的就是找出美国的不变。而在我专访完米尔斯海默之后，他和另外一位美国的大师坐下对谈，两人的对话是引爆了全网的热议。他对谈的就是美国哥伦比亚大学经济学教授，同时也是联合国可持续发展解决方案网络的主任杰佛里·萨克斯。2度被《时代》杂志评选为世界100名最具影响力的领袖之一的萨克斯，在10月底选前1周左右接受了我的岳阳独家专访，畅谈中美关系，还有美国的中东政策以及美国对俄罗斯的政策，谈的就是美国的不变。如今选后，这专访依旧值得细品，因为这正是看懂美国的关键。而且专访的最后，我还问了一个关于他私人的问题，答案令人动容。好，让我们一起进入这独家专访吧。
Thank you so much, Professor, for it's so nice to talk with you again.
My pleasure.
Where are you right now?
In Rome, actually.
In Rome for meeting over there?
Several meetings and a lot of travel for the next few weeks.
Wow. How many days you are away from home every year?
About half the year, actually. Yeah.
What? Okay.
Yeah, pretty nonstop, pretty much nonstop.
Okay, now let's talk about, actually, I know a lot of audiences, they saw your conversation with Professor Mearsheimer. I think it draws like millions of views, not just in the United States, but also in China. Many people ask me to ask you, how do you think about that conversation?
Well, first of all, Professor Mearsheimer is a wonderful scholar and a very good friend, but we disagree on our outlook, of course, with regard to the geopolitics of the world today. He thinks that conflict is pretty much inevitable because great powers clash. I believe that it's possible to get along because I don't think that there are fundamental differences of interest between the United States and China. In fact, I think the relationship is a positive sum relationship. China's well-being is good for the United States. U.S. well-being is good for China. There is no deep reason for conflict. But this is our difference of point of view, and we continue to discuss it. Unfortunately, the American political mindset is more along John Mearsheimer's line than it is mine, because while I know China very well personally and see no threat from China and no risk from China, people who don't know China well imagine all sorts of things. And also in Washington, people who are more interested in power than in well-being think that it's very important to be number one. This is not very interesting in my view. What I think is interesting is well-being, harmony, cooperation, and peace. That I see no intrinsic obstacle to achieving.
But the issue is not just in Washington. What we see right now, according to poll, more and more Americans have less and less positive views towards China. And to be honest, like China, they don't build 300 military bases around the United States. They don't send out troops to patrol the West. And why the public opinions are getting less and less positive?
Well, the public opinion is very much swayed by the official propaganda. And the U.S. official propaganda is that China is a threat. In fact, we even hear people talking openly about war with China within the next few years. Of course, I think that this is grotesquely irresponsible. There is no cause of war at all. This kind of talk should be absolutely not undertaken by responsible officials. But this is what the public hears. So I don't think that the public's view is formed by their own personal knowledge. Most Americans, unfortunately, have not had a chance to visit China or know people in China personally. And so what they believe is what they hear from their government. And the propaganda from the U.S. government has been pretty relentless in the last 10 years. This is very unfortunate and very irresponsible and very dangerous, I can add. But in the end, American foreign policy is made by a relatively small group. It's not made by public opinion. It is driven by strategists in the security apparatus, the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, the White House, the National Security Council. These people ought to know better. And this is what I keep saying. They are being absolutely irresponsible in their approach, and we need a different approach in the United States.
Can we get different approach, even if the election result were to be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? Can we get a different China policy?
Well, on the one hand, it's quite clear that American foreign policy is failing everywhere. Even the meeting in the BRICS in Kazan is a demonstration of failure. If you look at the 36 governments that were around the table in Kazan, they represent 57% of the world population. And in addition to those 36, there are dozens more that are very sympathetic. The large majority of the world does not believe that it is in the Western camp. If anything, it believes that it is in the group of countries seeking economic and sustainable development. It doesn't want to be in anybody's camp. It wants to have peace, security, and economic advancement. That's the main goal in most places in the world. The U.S. foreign policy is based on the idea of hegemony, that the U.S. must be the dominant power in every region of the world. But if you aim for that, you're bound to be in conflict with other powerful countries. And so the very definition of U.S. foreign policy puts us on a path of conflict. Now, can this change? Yes, because what is happening is not working. So any new group should absolutely analyze why is it that most of the world does not subscribe to the U.S. version of events? Why is it that most of the world is not together with the United States, for example, regarding the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East? I hope that American analysts and strategists understand that they are failing in their foreign policy. Of course, I've been saying this for many years. So far, it hasn't changed much, except it has raised actually the escalation. And I can say that in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, and not a bad indicator of where the foreign policy establishment is, the issue is about war. It's not about peace. It's not about a new foreign policy. It's mainly about war. And this is terribly dangerous and terribly wrong-headed. So I'm hoping that friends of the United States will also tell the U.S. that the current approach is far too dangerous. It's far too unproductive. It is, if anything, pushing countries into open opposition to the United States, and that bullying and making demands will not work. It won't work against China. It won't work against Russia. It won't work against even small countries now, which have choices. So this is my hope. It's not a high probability, frankly, of a quick change, but it's not impossible. If you analyze the situation rationally and carefully, you come to the conclusion that a very different foreign policy is needed. I think, if I may say one more point, our current foreign policy was set in place pretty much in the 1990s by Zbigniew Brzezinski and others. And Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in 1997 in a book called The Grand Chessboard that Russia, China, and Iran would not form an alliance. But of course, they have. Contrary to what Brzezinski said, this is a demonstration of the failure of the ideas that were put in place in the 1990s, because what Brzezinski said was we could bully Russia and they would have no alternative but to fall into line with the United States. But we bullied and bullied and bullied, and Russia said, you know what, we don't want to be bullied this way. And that is really a big part of the explanation of why events have gone the way they've gone.
And how do you see the differences of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris' China policy?
Well, they're both on the campaign trail expressing anti-China views. This is the pseudo-wisdom or the irresponsibility of political advisors who say to both of them, campaign against China, that will be good for the votes in Pennsylvania or in Michigan or in Illinois, Ohio, the so-called swing states in the American Midwest. But this is a game. This is not really an expression of deep thought. This is a political game designed by political advisors, not a reflection of true interests in the world, true good sense, and so on. So there's not a lot of difference between the two. Of course, Donald Trump is, in some sense, less predictable, but Kamala Harris is predictable and anti-China, and so that's not a very good predictability. So I wouldn't say that there's a marked difference between the two. The same goes with their Middle East policy. They both basically campaign to say who is more in love with Israel and Israel's wars. It's terrible because it's, again, a terrible mistake, a terrible injustice, but also it's driven by domestic political considerations, not good sense, decency, or international law.
And you also argue that in terms of economy, that the United States moving out the production line out of China is not going to solve any problem in the United States. While at the same time, we see both parties actually are pushing for the so-called decoupling. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is that starting around 2010, the American strategists came to the view that China's economic rise was no longer in America's interest. Again, this was a very naive and wrong assessment because it was based on a zero-sum vision of the world, that if China rises, America must be going down. Whereas in economic terms, we aren't in a zero-sum world, we're in a positive-sum world. China's growth, its technological advance, improves the U.S. economy. The U.S. growth and advance improves China's economy. In fact, when I had the discussion with John Mearsheimer, I was in California, and I think California has been enriched by China's economic development. A lot of people have made a lot of money based on China's economic growth, a lot of investments, a lot of very efficient production, for example, of my Apple iPhone. You know, it's produced in China. It's sold to countless millions of consumers around the world. It's good for Apple. It's good for us consumers. It's good for China for employment. This is how economics works. It's mutually beneficial. It's not good for one and bad for the other. Well, they were very surprised to hear that because we hear every day that China's bad for the United States. And this is simply a mistaken concept, but it plays into fear and it plays into ignorance. It's not to say that in some parts of the U.S., probably China's competitiveness has hurt local businesses in the United States. But in other places, it's dramatically improved the businesses in the United States. And what economic logic and history shows is that the gains definitely outweigh the losses, and that if the United States had better policy, instead of blaming China, it would have some internal redistribution so that the winners would be helping to compensate the losers, so that everybody would feel good about the economy. That's the basic logic of global trade, that it's on net favorable for the country, even if some places are losing from competition, the winning in other places more than outbalances the losses. And that logic means that we should have a system within any country of social transfers, retraining, reskilling, other kinds of programs to promote new industries, new jobs, quality jobs, and so forth. But that's a normal feature of an economy. It's no reason for the U.S. to blame China. It should be blaming itself for not having the right institutions internally to upgrade the workforce and move into new sectors with sufficient speed. We can also note that China has become the world's low-cost producer of many, if not most, of the technologies we need for the green transition. China's the world's low-cost producer of photovoltaics, of batteries, of electric vehicles, of wind turbines, of fourth-generation nuclear, of 5G, of long-distance power transmission, and so forth. Well, this is a great result for China. It's very good for countries that are partners with China in the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, because they get low-cost technology at very effective, good prices. For the United States, the real lesson is that during this last 10 years when China was building up its industry in these sectors, the United States was doing very little. It was debating, should we go to electric vehicles or not? Well, China said yes, it went to electric vehicles. Something like 400 producers got into the highly competitive market. Now it's being shaken down to a few, but these few are superb. And we have one. We have Tesla, very good, but it's one. China has dozens, hundreds even. And this is a big difference between the United States and China in the last 10 years. China just made this transformation. It went ahead. It didn't debate it. It did it. And the United States should do it as well, rather than complaining about China. Or maybe if Donald Trump comes in and he says, I don't believe in climate change, we'll have another 10 years in which the U.S. produces in dirty industries while China becomes the leader of the clean industries. That would be another tremendous competitive mistake of the United States, but it wouldn't be China's fault. It would be the fault of American politics.
Right. Now let's turn to the Middle East. You just mentioned about that. I'm always curious why the United States keep involving itself into the Middle East and cause so much bitterness around in the Muslim world. And at the same time, the United States doesn't need the oil from the Middle East. What happened?
Well, the U.S. Foreign policy often is led by very specific interest groups. And in the case of the Middle East, the so-called Israel lobby has been the dominant influence of American policy. So much of what's happening in the Middle East comes from the fact that there is unrest in Palestine and Israel, because while there is a state of Israel, there is no state of Palestine. And so millions of Palestinian Arabs are living under Israeli domination in a kind of apartheid regime. And this leads to unrest. And the answer to the unrest is very clear. There should be a state of Palestine based on the borders of Palestine as of June 1967. That's before a war gave Israel occupation of those Palestinian lands. There should be a state of Palestine. It should be admitted to the United Nations. It should live in peace side by side with Israel. And this way we should diffuse the tensions that are so rampant. But of course, maybe I shouldn't say of course, I think absolutely wrongly, the government of Israel has said, no, we want to dominate the territory. We don't want a Palestinian state. We will not give political rights to the people of Palestine. We will just rule over them. And Israel's idea is very simple, which is that if there is unrest, Israel will crush it. If other countries support the unrest, Israel will go to war with them. And if a major country like Iran backs militias or resistance groups that are fighting Israel's domination, then Israel wants to go to war with Iran. Now, the fact of the matter is Israel could not win a war with Iran. It needs the United States to fight that war. And so it's trying to get the United States to go to war with Iran. But it's not America's interest at all to have a war with Iran. But the political lobby of Israel drums up fear, drums up hatred, drums up a war atmosphere. And this is, by the way, one of the main reasons why the United States went to war with Iraq, because Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, went on a campaign in 2002, and it actually goes back to the 1990s, that the United States should go to war with Iraq. There was no reason for the United States to go to war with Iraq. Only Israel pressed us to do so. It was a foreign policy disaster. This is what is continuing to happen in the United States in this case. Our policy in the Middle East is guided by Israel's interests rather than America's interests. And it's time that and the American people don't like what's happening. It's time that the US, China, Russia, Britain, France, in the UN Security Council say there's a Palestinian state whether Israel likes it or not. The borders are those of the 4th of June, 1967. The UN is going to place peacekeeping forces to keep the two sides apart from each other. And we're going to move forward rather than having an escalating Middle East war. This would be the right approach. Right. There's no difference of interest whatsoever between China, Russia, and the US in this case, because a spreading Middle East war is bad for everybody. So the great powers should get together and put the solution into operation.
And now let's switch to the issue of Ukraine. We know Donald Trump say he can solve the issue once he's elected within 24 hours. How do you see this? And previously, we know the diplomatic establishment in the United States tried to stop him from alleviate the relationship with the tension with Russia. Can he beat the establishment this time?
Well, it's literally true that the war could stop in 24 hours because the main reason for this war is that starting back in 1994, 30 years ago, the United States aimed to move its military bases and NATO facilities to Ukraine. That goes back 30 years. The Ukrainians didn't want it, by the way. They knew that that would be destabilizing. But the U.S. policymakers were so arrogant that they had the idea that the U.S. can do whatever it wants. And in 2014, when the Ukrainian government did not want NATO, it wanted neutrality, the U.S. helped to overthrow that government. So on February 22nd, 2014, the United States conspired with some paramilitary groups in Western Ukraine to overthrow violently the Ukrainian government. Well, this is why then the new post-coup government called for NATO enlargement. But Russia had said all along, don't put NATO near our border. That's a threat to us. We don't accept it. And then when the United States played its role in the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, Russia said, we can see very clearly this is a threat to our national security. We don't want you to do that. And for many, many years, President Putin tried to negotiate with the U.S. presidents to tell them, stop NATO enlargement. I urged the U.S. government, don't enlarge NATO, announce that you won't. In that way, there won't be a war. This war could have been avoided even at the end of 2021. And even when, I should say actually more precisely, the war broke out in 2014, but the war escalated in 2022. And the escalation could have been avoided in 2021 if Biden had negotiated with Putin and if Biden had agreed, NATO will not enlarge, Russia will not escalate. That was a deal waiting to be made, but the U.S. rejected it. And then in March 2022, Ukraine actually agreed with Russia that Ukraine would return to neutrality. But the United States and Britain stopped that and told the Ukrainians to continue to fight. So this war could end very quickly if the United States would take away the cause of this war. The cause of this war is the U.S. intention to expand NATO to surround Russia, especially in the Black Sea region. That was the plan. Brzezinski spelled it out very clearly already back in the 1990s. And the plan has failed. Russia is not going to be defeated on the battlefield. It's going to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. And the big fear now is that this could escalate even to nuclear war and to total disaster unless the United States follows a sensible policy. And this is what either candidate should do when elected president, but whether they will learn how to do that and understand what this is about remains to be seen. And what will the CIA tell them? What will the Pentagon tell them? What will the interest group tell them about this? So far, we've been on a kind of straight course for 30 years to assert American hegemony. But obviously, it's failing, it's dangerous, and it needs to be completely revamped.
Last question. This is a question always in my mind. We know a lot of people turn to you because they do appreciate that you are telling the truth to the world. What motivates you to keep telling the truth while there are so many other experts and officials? They are fully aware of the fact and the truth, but they try not to say it, and actually they are doing harm to the human beings.
Well, I think several things motivate me. The first one is I want to avoid a conflict that could be devastating for the world. I don't want the U.S. and China or the U.S. and Russia to be in direct conflict. The consequences could be horrendous for everybody. Second, I have been involved on these issues for more than 30 years firsthand. I was an advisor to the economic team of President Mikhail Gorbachev. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin of Russia. I was an advisor to President Kuchma of Ukraine. I know this region. I've seen this play out over the last 30 years. I know many people in Russia. Russia is not an enemy of the United States. Of course, we're told that it is, but it is not. I know what President Yeltsin said face to face to me, which is we want normal, cooperative relations. I heard this face to face from President Gorbachev. So this is why, a second reason, there is no cause for this war at all. I think the third point is we have so much that we need to do together. China, the United States, Russia, the Gulf countries, Latin American countries, Africa, need to work together to protect the natural environment, to help children have a good future, to end extreme poverty on the planet. We have all adopted these goals, but they will not be achieved unless there is cooperation. And so I see only tragedy if we continue this course, which is so mistaken. And if I come back to my good friend John Mearsheimer, his famous book in foreign policy is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. He's a wonderful scholar. He has written a lot about tragedy, but we can't afford another tragedy. We're in the nuclear age. We need to find solutions, not simply write about tragedies. And since I know China, I've been visiting China now for 43 years, multiple times each year. I love China, civilization, China's history, China's successes. There is no cause for conflict. We need good relations, and this fear-mongering needs to stop so that we can get beyond this current very difficult and dangerous environment and move forward together.